Hi everybody, this is part 3. So if you haven't watched my other videos in the series, you can go back and take a look at those. I have 2 other parts and this is the 3rd part. So in this video we're going to be focusing on the tools and equipment that I use. Also I'll be showing you how I wash the yarn, how I hang it up to dry, how I skein it after I've done dyeing it. As well, we're going to talk about cleaning. So how I clean the tools that I use, which is very important. Washing pans, things like that. That's an important part of the dye process, even though it's not the most fun part, but it's necessary. So I'll be showing you how I deal with that as well. So I hope that you find this video very informative and useful and helpful on your dye journey. So let's get into it. So the things that I'm going to be discussing in this portion, most of it I've covered in my first video. So for example, I dye protein fibers. So again, in part 1, I explain what protein fibers are, but that's predominantly what I dye. And so I use acid dyes in order to do that. So the dyes, they come in a powdered form, and there's different companies that make it so you can do your research and find what you think will work for you. They come in different price points and different colors, so you'll find the company that will serve your purposes. So I use the dyes either in dry or powder form, so that's straight out of the jar. Or what I do is I mix them and use them in liquid form. So of course, another tool you're going to need is containers. If you're going to store your dyes in liquid form, you're going to want containers to store that liquid. And I labeled them so I know what they are, and I also have chosen to color code, or I arrange them by color. So I have yellow, orange, red, into the purples, blues, greens. So kind of I followed the color wheel, and it just helps me to stay organized, and I know where my dye is when I need it, and I can just grab it easily, and the workflow stays efficient because I dye a lot of yarn, so I need to move quickly to get the work done that I need to. So this really helps me when I can stay organized. Organization is key. So, I explain how I mix up my dyes. Of course, you're going to need acid when you're dyeing with acid dyes. So it's acid and heat, plus the dye. That's what's going to make the dye stick to the fibers. As well, you need your yarn. So this is pretty much how the yarn comes when I get it. And what I do is I just add additional ties. I use cotton string just to tie the yarn in a few more places, just to keep the yarn in place, because as I'm dyeing, I'm stirring it in the water. As you can imagine, this can get pretty tangled. So just to avoid that, I add extra string, and then also I clip on a zip tie as well. So that helps me when I'm dunking the yarn, swirling it around, when I'm handling it. That just makes life a lot easier. So those are things that you can consider. I cover how I prepare the yarn for dyeing also in part 1, but just to, since this is a video about tools, I'll just quickly show you. So again, we talked about the zip ties. So I just buy zip ties by the bagful. Now, you might not need to do that if you're just dyeing for fun, but I do find these useful. I also buy them in different colors because sometimes I'm dyeing more than one base, or I'm dyeing different types of yarn at the same time. And if I'm dyeing them the same color, I need to be able to tell them apart. So I use zip ties in different colors to help me identify what yarn it is so that I can, after they're done, label them properly. As well, string. I just use cotton string. Cotton string is perfect for tying up the yarn because it's cotton. So as I mentioned, I dye protein fibers, so the dye I use is a dye that will adhere to protein fibers. So since this is a plant-based fiber, those dyes won't really dye this. So that means that I can see the yarn easily and use it to pull the yarn out and manipulate it as I'm dyeing, and I can see these ties clearly. If I used a wool yarn then, or something like that, a protein fiber yarn, these strings would disappear and wouldn't be very helpful for me. And another tool that I use when I'm preparing the yarn is I sometimes will use a swift. So this one here is an upright one, an expandable and an umbrella type swift. I also have the table type swift that you put on top of a table, and then I will place the yarn over it and tie the string and put the zip ties on it. It's not a necessary tool, but it does help me, it does give me aid in preparing the yarn. So again, I show that in the first video. So those are the tools that I'm going to cover for yarn preparation, and now we're going to move on. But I just wanted to show you the common utensils and instruments that I use all the time when I'm dyeing yarn. And of course, these are by no means everything that you need, or you might find when you dye your yarn that there's other tools that you use instead. You'll find other things that work better for you, or there's things here that won't work for you. This is just what I use and what I find works for me. Measuring spoons. I use the measuring spoons when I'm measuring out dye. When I'm mixing the dye, I'll use measuring spoons to know how much dye and how much water to add to my pre-mixed liquid dyes. So I'll use the measuring spoons for that to get the right ratio of dye. Spoons are very handy too. I use these when I'm sprinkling the dye onto the fibers. And I like to use just disposable plastic spoons. They're cheap, and I can still wash those and reuse them. And I find these last a long time. Metal spoons, of course, would work great as well, so you can do that. I use mesh strainers as well. So I just get these at the dollar store. They're very cheap. And again, I use these for when I'm sprinkling dye onto the fibers. So you can see mine are well used. They have actually rusted and come apart, but I can still use them, so you know, I haven't thrown these out yet. But again, these are easily replaceable. So I find these very useful. But again, you don't have to use a strainer. If you want to speckle your fibers, I mean, I've seen people just pinch the dye with their fingers and sprinkle it on. Some might just use like a spoon and just sprinkle the yarn or sprinkle the dye on like that. But I found for myself personally, I like to place the dye in a sieve and then just sprinkle the yarn like this, and it gives me a nice, even, and fine speckle of the dye powder over the fiber. So that's my preference. Measuring cups. Pretty much, I use these again to measure out the amount of dye that I need for each, say for the colorway that I'm doing. In my recipes, I will write out how much of each color I'm going to be putting onto the yarn. So the measuring cups are helpful because they tell me the measurements on that, so I can do that. And then at the same time, I can just pour directly from these onto the yarn. So very useful. Others choose to use squeeze bottles. I don't use these often. I used to, but then I just found, just for the way that I like to apply yarn, I'm not a very precise person. I kind of like to just kind of go with the feel of things. So I found that just pouring straight from these cups works better for me. You know, instead of, you know, I find, you know, perhaps measuring out my dye and then having to pour it into a squeeze bottle to apply it, it just interrupted the workflow and the creativity for me. So I really don't use these too much, but they're a great tool to use. You can experiment and see if you like it. So spoon. I use a spoon to stir the yarn around, to help me lift the skeins, to manipulate it. So this is very useful as well. You could use like a stir stick. Others have used like things like that, or a dowel or something like that. But I find that this spoon works good for me. A whisk. Now I use this to help dissolve dye. So when I'm mixing the dye powder in water, if I'm doing just a small amount, usually this is the measuring cup that I'll use when I'm doing mixing up just a small amount of dye. And then I'll whisk the dye powder into the water just to make sure that it disperses. So that's useful for small amounts. And a funnel. This is just a practical thing to use. I use this when, again, I'm filling up my dye jars, like those big jars that I showed you. I will put this on top of the opening of the jar, you know, put my dye powder in, fill it with water, and then that just helps everything get into the jug and not make a big mess. So again, I found this very useful. This might not be something that you necessarily need though. And then, of course, because dyeing yarn is a messy process, so just make sure that you've got lots of things to clean up with, to clean up spills, to wipe down surfaces. You know, I just use, you know, cleaning cloths and towels. I've got bins full of towels and dishcloths so that I can clean as I go and keep everything as dye-free and pleasant to work in, because yeah, just because it's messy doesn't mean you have to work in a mess. Gloves, rubber gloves. Now, I personally hate the feel of gloves on my hands when I'm working with the yarn. So usually I'll start off by putting these gloves on, but then by the end of the day, I end up not wearing them. So as you can see, I was able to scrub quite a bit of the dye off, so my hands are not nearly as bad as they were yesterday, but you can see my nails are still stained. So sorry about that, it's gross, but yeah, my hands were basically purple yesterday because I dyed a lot of purple. So if I wore these gloves, I would have been able to avoid that, but I don't really care. So you can buy disposable gloves if you want to keep your hands clean. Also, because you're working with hot yarn, at least I will put these on when I'm pulling yarn out of the oven, usually. I do have pretty tough hands that I can deal with quite a bit of heat, so you'll see in my videos, and I've even gotten comments, people wondering, you know, isn't that hot when you pull it out of the oven? And the answer is yes. It does hurt, but I bear it. But I don't recommend that you do that, so be smart, wear gloves. And talking about protective things, most importantly, when you are working with dye, with the loose dye powder, make sure that you are wearing some kind of a mask or a, what is this called? A filter, dust mask, anything like that that will help to protect your lungs so that you're not breathing in those loose dye powders. So let me just show you what I mean. You know, so look at this. So see that loose powder in there. So of course I don't have a mask on, but anyways. So you can just imagine, this is very fine. So when you're sprinkling this or transferring it out of the jars, making it into liquid form, those particles can easily be airborne. You can breathe that in. And of course, this is a chemical. So you don't want that in your lungs. So make sure that when you're dealing with the powder like this, when it's loose, wear a mask. It might even be a good idea, even though it's not very comfortable. And I have to say I'm guilty of it. I don't always do this, but it might be a good idea just to wear a mask through the whole dye process, because when you're dealing with the hot fibers, the vapor or the steam coming up from the yarn fibers as you're dyeing, who knows what's in that too. That might not be the best thing to breathe in as well. So speaking of that, it's good also if you can. Now everyone's workspace is different. If you can have proper ventilation. So I am very fortunate. I have a ventilation system right above my workspace. So I can just turn that on. Can you hear that? So that helps circulate the air. So when I'm sprinkling the yarn here, a lot of those particles will then be caught up into this and then put outside. Another practical thing to have is a notebook. So when you're playing around with your dyes, or if you're serious about dyeing yarn and you want to consider doing that as more than a hobby, or even if you're just playing around and you want to duplicate the colors that you've done, it's a good idea to record or write everything down. Even the smallest detail, write it down. Write down how much water you used, how much acid, how much dye, the order in which you applied the dye or the acid. You know, just anything that you can think of so that you can recreate what you did. If you're really happy with what you made, there's nothing more frustrating than not being able to remember what you did. So keep good notes. That's what I do because I have to. I'm running a business. The colors I have are repeatable colors. So that means that I want to be able to get similar results over and over so that I can sell the same colorways time and time again. So what I do is I write everything down. In other words, I make a recipe. So I keep all of my dye recipes in this book, you know. And I also make sure to put the papers in plastic protectors. Because again, I'm working around water and dye. I want to make sure that I keep those recipes clean so that I can see them. So that's another tool that you might find very handy to have. Now you're going to need something to put your yarn in so that you can dye it. So I use these pans, but you can use pots. Just make sure that it is a non-reactive container. So because we're dealing with acid, we want it to be in something like this, like stainless steel, so that the acid doesn't react with the container that you're putting your yarn into. So these pans, they're just restaurant style pans that you can get from, you can just do your research and find where you can get it. Usually restaurant supply stores have these. And I have mine in 2 sizes. So these are called full pans. And this is, I would say, about 4 inches deep. And this is maybe 2.5. So I find that these 2 sizes, depending on the method of dyeing that I'm doing or the color that I'm doing, I will use either one of those sizes to accommodate the yarn. As well, when you're dyeing the yarn, of course, you're going to need a heat source. So I think the second video talks about heat. So that's obviously one of the components of dyeing yarn, dyeing protein fibers. You need heat. So this is what I used to use. This is just a hot plate or a table surface, a tabletop burner. And so I had about 6 of these that I would line up, and then I would, put my hands on top and then put my yarn and do my dye application that way. And it worked great for me for years. As my business grew, I found that this method was not very convenient because I could only dye so much yarn at a time, and I needed to be able to do a larger volume as my business grew. So I have changed, and you can see in my recent videos how I've changed to now using a warming oven or a proofing oven. Now, this might seem like a weird tool to mention, but I think it's one of the most important tools that you're going to need or have at your disposal, and that is light. We're dealing with color. Light is what makes it possible for us to even see color. So it's very important for us to have good light when dyeing yarn, because we want to see the color as true as possible. And your quality of light can greatly affect how you see the color that you're dyeing. So I just want to give an example of what I'm talking about. So if you look at the video right now, it's untouched. It hasn't been manipulated in any way. Usually when I edit my videos, I don't go too crazy, but I do sharpen up some of the images. I bump up the color a little bit to make it look more true to life. But I want to show you just how this looks straight out of the camera, and just focus on how the light looks. Do you see a difference? So when you're looking at that video, doesn't it look like you're looking through a yellow filter? So again, that video hasn't been touched at all. It's just straight out of the camera. But it does look like there's a yellow haze, or like you're looking through, like there's been a yellow filter put over the lens. Now that's because of the light that I had in the room. So this video that I'm in right now, I changed all of the light bulbs. And so I'm using a daylight bulb. So that's what I have in my studio. Daylight is going to give you the best lighting, or the best lighting, so that you can see color in its true form. You actually are, when you're looking at it, you're seeing what's actually there. And so that's why, like, photographers will always talk about, like, the best light to do your photography is with natural daylight. So in my studio, I don't have any windows, I'm in a basement, so I don't have access to natural light. So I have to mimic that. And so I use light bulbs that are rated as daylight bulbs. And you just look at the back, the information on the light bulb, and it will tell you, it'll give you a rating. And it'll literally say daylight. So the bulbs that most people have in their homes, and that's what I had in the video that was really yellow, is just like your normal, 60-watt bulb that is, they usually call it soft light or warm light, or, most people, that's the lighting that they have in their homes because it's warm and inviting. But it is the worst lighting for when you're dealing with color. So I've talked about when dyeing color, we want to have that natural light to see. So here's another little tip: in your bathroom, install the same daylight bulbs as well, so that you can really see your face, see what you really look like. For example, when you're looking in the mirror, applying makeup or so forth, you really want a true idea of what you actually look like. So use daylight bulbs, and that's my little tip about that. So now we're going to talk about another tool that I use, and that is, of course, a sink. So when you're dyeing yarn, you're going to need a water source. That's a given. And you might just have access to your kitchen sink or a laundry sink, whatever. But you're going to need a place to soak yarn. You're going to need a place to wash pans, and you're going to need a place to mix your dyes. So you're going to need a sink. So this sink is, I would say that this is the hub, or this is the center of my dye studio. Everything happens here. And this sink is a real workhorse. So of course, because I have a hand-dyed yarn business, I have a huge sink like this. Most people are not going to have that, but you are going to need a water source, and I just wanted to point that out as well. So most people are too. I'm very fortunate that I can have a dedicated place to dye my yarn. Again, if you're doing it as a hobby, most people aren't going to have that. So things to keep in mind is when you're dyeing yarn, when you're playing around and experimenting, if you have to say use your kitchen, well, your kitchen is where you prepare food. So just make sure that whatever tools, pans, utensils, that those stay dedicated to your yarn dyeing. Don't use those to prepare food. Don't use those to any utensils that you've dyed with. Don't use that to eat with. So that's very important. That has to stay separate. So, label them or keep them in an area. Whatever materials you use for dyeing your yarn, keep those separate so that you know that those are just specifically for your dyeing. Because dyes are so messy, if you're, say, working in your kitchen too, you probably will need to lay out newspapers, plastic over your countertops, protect your backsplash, things like that, just to keep things clean and not to cross-contaminate your dyes, possibly into your food, because you don't want that. So I realized that, the setup that I have here, it's because it's a business that I have. So realistically, you're not going to be set up the same way. So just keep that in mind. I think it's really important that people know that. Of course, dyeing yarn is fun, and who doesn't want to try it? But just remember that you're probably going to have to go through a lot more steps to keep yourself safe than I have to, just because you're just not going to have the setup that I have. So be aware of that. So now that we've talked about our sink, I'm now going to go into demonstrating how to wash yarn, how I hang it up to dry, and also we're going to talk about cleanup, cleaning our pans and utensils, because that all happens here as well. So let's get on into that.